Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. My name is Jack Ferguson. If you haven't listened in before, I'm an evidence-based brand consultant and I do this podcast for senior marketers. I do this so that you can feel seen, get ideas for stakeholder management and persuasion, and talk strategy. Because frankly, we just don't get the chance to talk strategy enough as marketers. I do release an episode every week. Sometimes it's a solo episode like today. Sometimes I co-host it with another senior marketer. But today it's a solo episode and I am going to talk about a TV show that you might be quite familiar with, Friends. And more specifically, from a brand building perspective, why the theme song of Friends was or is the perfect distinctive asset and how this asset grew their brand. I think it's quite an interesting story. So I thought I'd share that with you today. I've done quite a bit of research on this and I wanted to talk it through because I think there's some things that we can all learn from it. So if you're not familiar, the TV show Friends was first released back in 1994, but it has remained quite popular for the last 30 years, well, at least relative to other TV shows. It started off very popular and was about 3 times as popular as other shows when it first came out on average. And that popularity has increased relative to other shows that were released at that same time. And I'll discuss why that's happened and why we should care. So I wasn't an avid watcher of the show myself, but I can appreciate how well the theme song contributed to the show's or the brand's ongoing success. So the brand in this case being Friends, the TV show, when I refer to the brand. So you may know the song, you probably know the song. It's called I'll Be There For You. I can't play it for you right now because of royalties and all that type of thing, but it played over the opening credits as the cast danced around a water fountain. What you might not know is that was originally just a TV jingle, so it wasn't originally written as a full song. But something really interesting happened when the TV show was released, and the jingle was so popular that radio stations were playing it, and people were requesting it, and they were calling it the Friends song because that's all it was at the time. It was 43 seconds long, and it was quite unusual for radio stations to play a 43-second jingle, but they were because it was so popular. And what happened from that point of view is the composers of the song who worked on the show didn't miss their moment, to their credit, and they worked with the Rembrandts, the band who performed the song, to record a full-length single in early 1995. And then after they recorded the single, they released it as a single soon after. From that, the ongoing airtime compounded the salience of the Friends brand, and it produced a flywheel effect that I think we all love for our own brands. I'll explain how that worked, but firstly, I'll just touch off on a couple of important metrics so you know what I'm saying if you're not familiar with them already. One being fame. So when I refer to fame, it means the percentage of category buyers who recognize an asset. So in this case, it would be the percentage of TV viewers who recognize the theme song. The second metric is uniqueness. So how strongly that asset links back to a single brand. So in this case, when someone hears the song, how strongly that links back to being part of the Friends brand. So fame is recognizing the song, uniqueness is linking it back to the Friends brand. So they did a great job. The Friends brand did a great job of building that uniqueness and fame for the asset. But I'd argue that's only part of the story because a song can be played on the radio, at bars, at gatherings or parties, and it presents a number of situations where the audience's attention is brought back to the brand. But the brand isn't really paying for that specific exposure. So Friends, the brand, is consistently directly cued for existing viewers of the show when they hear it, quote unquote, out in the wild. So at a bar, at a radio, at a party. And it's indirectly triggered by spillover. So someone may hear the song at a party and they may say to someone who's a non-viewer, this is the Friends song. Do you watch the show? I love this show. So there is almost a compounding with zero additional media spend. When it's heard out in the wild, when it's linked back to the Friends brand, it pushes people back to consume the Friends brand and reinforce that uniqueness and fame again. So I think there's a few things unique to this situation. So as far as exposure of the theme song from the show, that's actually stayed really flat over time. So you'd think that a show was released in 1994 and over time it would decline, the exposure. It actually hasn't. And over the last 30 years, it's actually even appreciated in the last few years a little bit. So in 1994, 95, around the launch, my modelling suggested that there's about 3 times the exposure that a comparable show was getting that it was launched at the same time. So not a huge surprise there because it was a popular show. What's more interesting, though, is that around 10 years later, when syndication for the show peaked, so from about 2000 to 2019, Friends was syndicated across over 100 countries, which means it's running on multiple networks daily and airing hundreds of times per week globally. At that time, the exposure of the show, or the asset in the show, if we're talking about branding, was about 9 times a comparable TV show. So Friends' overall viewership hadn't declined. In fact, it had grown slightly, while comparable shows tended to drop off dramatically by the 10-year mark, hence the 9x difference between the exposure that Friends was getting in 2005 compared to a comparable show. So if we move on to 2015 now, which was around the pre-streaming transition, the show was getting about 36 times the average exposures of an average comparable show that had been around for 20 years. Which is quite incredible, really. So when Friends hit Netflix, I believe it was 2015 in the US and 2018 in Australia, it did trigger a second life cycle. And Netflix did report that Friends was one of its most watched shows globally until about 2020, with billions of hours streamed. It's important, obviously, to compare this back to another show or the average show, because if you're just saying that Friends did well because streaming came along, well, so should every brand when streaming came along, like every show. Friends was performing at about 36x. Now, this all relates to in-show exposure for the theme song. And that's increasing the fame of the song, but also increasing and reinforcing the uniqueness of the linkage between the song and the Friends brand. But that's only one side of the story. I wanted to talk about the reinforcement loop driven from the wild or everyday life. So in 1995, when it was a radio hit, this song, so getting played on radio and whatnot, the exposure at the time compared to a relative theme song was about 3 to 5x. This did decline over the years. So by about 2005, the estimates is that, there's probably getting about 10% of the airplay in the wild compared to when it was first released. But again, if we compared that to another brand where theme songs, tend to drop off the face of the earth, it still was about 10x times better than a relative brand. If we bring on 2015 and the streaming and the nostalgia that was triggered at the time, the listening to this song in the wild skyrocketed. So it may have got, like my modelling suggests, maybe 500,000 to 1 million plays per year in about 1995. In 2015, we can assume that's more like 10 million. So it actually 10x'd the principle that it started with. By this stage, it is maybe 100x times a comparable brand. So quite incredible. That has roughly continued to appreciate over time, with memes coming to the party as well in the last few years, while other comparable shows continue to decline in their relevance, or other comparable theme songs continue to decline in their relevance. Incredibly, according to one of the charts that I found, I'll Be There For You, the song, is streamed 96,000 times per week in the UK as of this year. So quite incredible numbers still. So the Friends brand achieved a level of success because of these dual reinforcement loops. So the fame and uniqueness of the song was reinforced from the show, and then the prominence, so how often this song was played in the wild beyond the show, reinforced that feedback loop and brought people who were watching the show to remember to watch it again, but also exposed other people to an asset of the show in the ways that I discussed before. So both loops are quite dependent on each other. So once distribution ends and there's no cultural flywheel anymore, both can collapse. Friends is very much an outlier here. Most shows get only the first loop and they only get it briefly, typically. So you may be thinking, oh, cool, like this is a TV show, kind of interesting story. It's a very unique circumstance and one with a hit song as its theme. And I get that sounds really unique. What the hell can you do with it, right? So I want to make some comparisons to other categories now and just provoke some thought. This is not to say that we're going to be able to replicate the success of Friends. It's a very unique time. And even the fact that it had maintained its popularity around the world and sustained that until streaming came to the party and then was able to springboard off that again is very unique. There are things that are unique about this situation. It is an outlier in many ways, but I am getting somewhere with this. I want to compare this theme song to another distinctive asset I personally love, which is the Bundaberg rum polar bear. So growing up, I'd see Bundy R Bear on ads that were associated with Bundaberg rum. And I quite liked those ads as a kid or as a young adult. This bear was always up to no good. You may remember that he was a drop bear at times. Obviously, he's always in the pub drinking rum, stirring the pot. So he's a funny character, but the fame and uniqueness associated with that brand is quite strong. Bundaberg rum did quite a good job of building fame and uniqueness with this bear. The issue with a asset like this is that we go about our lives and we don't necessarily see many polar bears. To have that feedback loop play back into the brand and brand salience and build that flywheel, it's not something that would happen to most people unless you work in a zoo or something like that. You may see a polar bear on a David Attenborough documentary, but for most of us, it's going to be really difficult to reinforce that flywheel. The prominence for this asset is quite low. So what may be a better accessible flywheel in comparison? Sticking on the theme of animals, I would say magpies in Australia. They're known, they have fame, and they're not necessarily as special as a polar bear. So they'd have less competition for uniqueness, for being attributed to one brand alone. And you encounter them, if you live in Australia, more often than you do polar bears. So prominence is higher. We could look at the AFL team, for example, the Collingwood Football Club, who are also known as the Collingwood Magpies. The magpie is one of their distinctive assets, and they've had that asset since 1892. So from a prominence perspective, provided that the brand did a good job of building uniqueness, in other words, they did a good job of linking a magpie back to the brand, it would be a better asset, in my opinion, to build fame and uniqueness with. So the consideration I'm putting to you today is that not to just think about fame and uniqueness when we consider building our brand's distinctive assets, but to also consider prominence. So how often that asset or assets are going to be encountered in the wild or have some cultural relevance that can be tied back to you, happening in life that may trigger your brand because you are associated with said thing. I wanted to give you something to think about today. I told the story through the Friends theme song and their distinctive asset as basically as good as it gets, but we can still think about this principle for ourselves. Yes, we want to build fame. Yes, we want to build uniqueness, but we also want to consider prominence when we choose a distinctive asset. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back in your ears next week.